History textbooks sketched the final days of World War II in Europe as a clean cartographic exercise, a synchronized Allied victory, tidy and mutual. But behind closed doors, during that first week of May 1945, a single German general was engineering a gambit that could have cracked the Yalta Agreement wide open, could have ignited the Cold War months early. His plan was to march hundreds of thousands of men westward, in direct violation of international treaties, and force a surrender upon General George Patton, a man who made no secret of his contempt for his Soviet allies. Grasping how this impossible dilemma played out demands understanding what the ground actually looked like. Not one crisis, but 100,000 separate ones, each resolved by the specific logic of the specific person standing in it. And those calculations were being warped by a variable absent from earlier stages of the conflict, one that was fundamentally reshaping how the war's final chapter unfolded. That variable was the Russians. The westward momentum of Soviet forces had reached a scale and ferocity that dwarfed even the Third Army's impressive operations. Entire German army groups had been encircled and annihilated. Cities changed hands after battles lasting days, leaving nothing but rubble where streets had been. The consequence was predictable and visceral. German soldiers and civilians who had experienced the Soviet advance firsthand, or heard accounts from those who had, carried a terror of falling into Russian hands that was categorically different from any anxiety about American captivity. This wasn't merely wartime propaganda, though the Nazi regime had weaponized such fears relentlessly. It was grounded in concrete experience. The Eastern Front had been a theater of violence without equivalent. The Western Front existed in a different moral universe entirely. Combatants on both sides understood this with perfect clarity. The ripple effects of that understanding surfaced everywhere in those final days. German units and their commanders made choices that would have been unthinkable 12 months earlier. The most consequential of these, measured by military scale and political fallout alike, involved a German force operating inside Czechoslovakia during the first week of May 1945. This force comprised the remnants of Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. It remained substantial. Its significance had nothing to do with reversing the war's outcome. That question was settled. What mattered was its status as one of the largest intact German formations still in the field. Hundreds of thousands of men, considerable equipment, a command structure still functioning with that characteristic German military precision, functioning long after any rational hope of victory had dissolved. Schörner himself defies simple characterization, a devoted Nazi, a merciless disciplinarian. He held his command together through methods his own officers considered extreme, and these were Wehrmacht officers in 1945, men whose threshold for extremity had already been stretched beyond recognition. Hitler had personally elevated him to Field Marshal in the war's dying weeks. Less a military honor than a political signal, a declaration that Hitler valued commanders willing to fight until the end, regardless of battlefield reality. In the final hours, Schörner would desert his own troops, abandon the very men he had brutalized into obedience, a fitting conclusion for someone driven by that particular cocktail of fanaticism and survival instinct. But in the days before that desertion, the officers beneath Schörner were running their own calculations. Among them, General Hermann Balck, commanding a significant portion of the forces in the Czech theater. Balck reached a decision that was simultaneously logical from a military standpoint and extraordinary from a political one. He would not surrender to the Russians. He intended to surrender to the Americans instead, and he meant to bring every last soldier he could with him. This scheme took shape despite a hard reality. Allied agreements had already placed Balck's forces squarely inside the Soviet operational zone. What he proposed wasn't a battlefield surrender. It was a political act. one that cut directly against the framework Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had hammered out at Yalta. And the scale of what Balck wanted to move was staggering. Not a regiment, not a division, an entire army. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, their equipment, their supply columns, their command apparatus, all of it pushing west through Czechoslovakia toward American positions, racing to outrun Soviet forces closing from the east. The logistics alone bordered on impossible. The political weight was crushing. And the clock was merciless, measured in hours, not days. Soviet units were advancing fast. The gap between German and American lines was shrinking with every passing moment. Balck sent his envoys forward to the American side. They reached Patton's headquarters. And when Patton examined the proposal his forward units had relayed, he stood at the intersection of one of the Western Front's most consequential choices: military, political, deeply human. No standard doctrine could contain it. The military logic for taking Balck's surrender was straightforward. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers crossing to the American side meant fewer enemy combatants, fewer casualties, no need for further combat operations to destroy them. It meant the clean collapse of a major German formation without a grinding battle. It meant American soldiers going home instead of dying in the closing hours of a war already decided. But the political calculus ran far more tangled. Yalta had drawn clear zones of influence. The Soviet zone belonged to Soviet authority. German forces inside that zone were expected to surrender to the Soviets. Accepting Balck's army would break those agreements. It would amount to seizing assets earmarked for Moscow. And it would be a decision far above Patton's authority, one carrying consequences for the post-war Allied relationship that no single general had the standing to dictate. Patton understood all of this. 3 decades in the American military had taught him where his authority ended and where his superiors began. He pushed the decision up the chain. He contacted Bradley. Bradley contacted Eisenhower. At the highest levels of Allied command, the question was debated with an urgency the situation demanded. Every hour spent deliberating was an hour the Soviet advance narrowed Balck's window. The decision that emerged satisfied no one completely and was likely the only answer the constraints allowed. Patton received authorization to accept the surrender of German forces that physically reached American lines. He was not, however, permitted to actively facilitate their movement. He could not deliberately hold corridors open in a way that looked like a coordinated effort to redirect German troops away from Soviet control. The distinction was razor thin, almost meaningless in practice, but it gave Patton just enough legal and political cover, and he used every inch of it. He met Balck at a forward American command post in the first days of May. By every account from those who witnessed it, this meeting ranked among the strangest encounters of the entire war. Balck, a German general who had spent years commanding forces for a regime that no longer existed, was handing over an army of hundreds of thousands to an enemy commander, specifically to avoid surrendering to a different one. And he did so knowing full well that the post-war world's geopolitical architecture was being shaped in real time by decisions made in rooms exactly like this. Patton sat across from him and asked directly, "How many men did Balck intend to bring over?" Balck gave him a number. Patton studied it. Then he asked whether Balck understood that every one of those men would be processed as prisoners of war under American and international protocols, not folded into any other branch of service, not promised anything beyond what the Geneva Convention already guaranteed. Patton made the boundaries explicit. Balck's cooperation in an orderly capitulation was the ceiling. Balck confirmed he understood. Patton told him that would have to do, because nothing else existed to offer. Then Patton said something the officers in that room would later remember as the sharpest distillation of the moment they encountered during the war's dying hours. He told Balck he grasped exactly why the general had made this choice. He would not pretend otherwise. The fear of the Soviet advance was legitimate, rooted in events that had actually occurred, and he refused to demean Balck's intelligence by calling it baseless. The soldiers coming through would be treated properly. That was a commitment Patton intended to honor. Not merely because he kept his word, but because these were men who had fought in a war now finished. Whatever they had done during that war, the existing mechanisms built for exactly those questions would handle it. But then came the critical point. Balck needed to understand something without ambiguity. The Soviet Union was an ally of the United States. The agreements binding the Allied powers formed the framework governing Patton's actions, regardless of what he personally felt. His private opinions on the Soviets and the shape of the post-war world had no bearing on this conversation. He would not be sharing them. What mattered, the only thing that mattered, was this. Balck was surrendering to the United States Army. That army would process the capitulation according to its commitments with Allied nations and its obligations under international law. The surrender belonged to the institution, not to any single man, and the institution carried responsibilities that outweighed whatever sentiments Patton harbored privately. Every officer present agreed on one thing afterward. This was extraordinary restraint from someone legendary for lacking it. Patton's feelings about the Soviet Union were an open secret across the Third Army. He had voiced them with characteristic bluntness on enough occasions that they reached Eisenhower. They fed a growing conviction at the highest echelons of Allied command that Patton was evolving into a political liability, even as he remained an indispensable military asset. He knew his own mind, and in this room, facing the German general who had delivered hundreds of thousands of troops, partly because both men shared certain apprehensions, Patton chose to speak for the institution rather than himself. That choice kept the exchange anchored to its essential boundaries. The surrender was processed. The men came through. The scale defied easy comprehension, even for Patton's staff, veterans of weeks of capitulations who still struggled with the numbers. The flood of soldiers pouring across American lines was at once a military surrender and a mass human migration. Men who had spent years at war, now driven by a single imperative, reached the right side of a line before it moved. The Soviets protested. Their objection traveled through diplomatic channels and drew the kind of meticulously crafted responses such channels produce, replies that satisfied nobody, settled nothing, and simply papered over a tension destined to define half a century of European history. Patton stayed clear of those exchanges. He had operated within his authorized limits and respected the boundaries imposed on him. The political consequences belonged to a level above his command, a reality he recognized and accepted. He recorded the meeting with Balck in his diary. He described the German as a professional soldier who had reached a rational conclusion inside an irrational situation, a decision Patton respected, even if he could not extend that respect to every circumstance preceding it. The men who crossed over were now prisoners. They were being treated as they should be. That, he wrote, was the right outcome. The end of the war in Europe was producing conditions no military training had truly prepared anyone for. The only tool available was judgment, flawed, imperfect, but the sole instrument at hand. He wrote that he hoped the calls made in those closing hours were correct, then conceded he couldn't know, couldn't ever know, and that he'd have to live with that. For a man who'd staked his entire identity on the conviction that certainty was a foundation of command, that admission carried enormous weight. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The soldiers who had crossed the lines with Balck sat an American prisoner of war facilities when the final capitulation came through. They were breathing. They would eventually go back to whatever version of Germany remained, whatever fractured existence awaited in the rubble of total defeat. In the spring of 1945, that alone was no trivial thing. That alone was a victory of its own kind. Patton was at his headquarters when the formal surrender transmission arrived. His staff braced for a pronouncement, some declaration worthy of the moment's gravity. What they got was silence. Patton sat still for a beat, then asked what came next. Occupation was beginning, and there was work ahead. George Patton had never known what to do with endings. His mind always reached for whatever lay beyond. What lay beyond was 6 more months in a world that had no idea what to do with a man whose entire reason for existing had just been fulfilled. He died in December 1945. The circumstances still invite argument. A Heidelberg hospital, injuries from a car accident that may or may not have been an accident, depending on which account you find credible. They buried him in Luxembourg among his men, in the soil of a country his army had fought to free. What Patton might have become in the post-war world, had he survived long enough to fully wrestle with it, stands as one of the 20th century's most compelling, unanswered questions. Balck outlived the war. He was eventually prosecuted for crimes connected to his command in Norway, events predating Czechoslovakia and those final chaotic days. Convicted, sentenced. He served his time, was released, and died in Germany decades later. Whether the choice he made in early May of 1945, marching his men toward American lines instead of abandoning them to the Soviet advance, factored into his legal proceedings, remains unclear from the record. That kind of decision didn't fit the machinery built to process the war's aftermath. Those systems were designed to look backward. Balck's decision looked forward, a desperate lunge at controlling what came next. The war's conclusion in Europe resisted clean resolution. Almost nothing ended tidily. Nearly every element demanded you hold 2 competing truths at the same time, without letting either cancel the other. Patton had understood this during his encounter with Balck. He represented his institution. He kept his personal convictions locked away. He processed the surrender, and then wrote privately that he hoped he'd gotten it right, though he couldn't be sure. For a man built the way Patton was built, that restraint was a remarkable evolution. Arguably the most sophisticated act of his entire career, and it happened in near total obscurity, in a meeting that most war histories barely acknowledge, during those first days of May 1945, when everything was ending and no one yet knew what would begin.